Welcome to my channel, and welcome to this video on how to play chess. If you already know how each piece moves and what they're called and the basic rules of the game, feel free to skip this video. It's not for you. Maybe I will make a follow-up video later on a few basic strategies. This video is on how to play chess for absolute beginners. If it seems intimidating at first, it's not. If you think of all the other video games or even board games that you play, sometimes there are far more pieces and complexities than there are in chess. Things to remember, rolls of the dice that change the rules depending on whether you roll doubles, and etc. and so on. Think of, I don't know, Monopoly, where there are 8 different, moving pieces and dozens of properties and rents and mortgages and etc. Chess, there are 2 players. One plays with the white pieces, one plays with the black pieces. Each player has 16 pieces to begin, and they're identical in number and position. Now, the board, 64 squares of alternating colors, 8 squares wide, 8 squares from front to back. Obviously would be flat on a table or floor chessboard. On a screen, it's going to be vertical. That's how screens work. Now, there are, for each player, 8 pawns. Those are these pieces across the front. Pawns, P-A-W-N. There are 2 rooks, R-O-O-K, which look like little castle towers. And many people will call them castle for slang. There are 2 horsies, which are called knights, K-N-I-G-H-T. There are 2 bishops for each player. 1 bishop on a light square, 1 bishop on a dark square. That's important. We'll get to that later. There's 1 queen per player, and 1 king per player. On most chess sets that I have seen, the king is the one with the little cross on top. I assume that's because these boards and piece designs were developed in Western Christianized nations, but I have seen chess sets without the crosses on the kings. Typically, the king is the tallest piece on the board, when the queen will be close to that in height if you're using a physical board. Now, the way the pieces move is we're going to start with the pawns because they're out front, and almost always they're the pieces that are moved first. If you can see these 2 green dots, I have this chessboard set up to show the legal moves when you click on a piece. On the first move, any pawn can move 1 square or 2. For example, that's a legal move. Also, that's a legal move. 1 or 2 on the first move. After that, well, now it's black's turn. After that, the pawn can only move 1 square forward. It can't move 2 anymore, just 1. Okay. And you will have noticed that the colors alternate turns. White always moves first, black always moves second, and then it's white's turn again. You get to move 1 piece per turn. That's how it works. Now, pawns are unique. They are the only piece that do not capture in the same direction that they move. And because they can only move forward, when another piece is in front of them, they can't move. All the other pieces capture in the same direction that they move. Pawns can only capture forward and diagonally. So, for example, if this were the next move of the game, now this pawn can move. It can capture the piece that was in front of it diagonally. If this pawn had been moved instead, then the black pawn could capture this way diagonally, but cannot move forward. There is one special exception, and that is called en passant. For example, let's say that was black's second move. White moved forward. Now, normally, you cannot capture here because there's no piece. However, because this pawn went past the square where it could have been captured by this pawn, there is a special rule in chess called en passant. I believe it means in passing. Regardless of its origins, which Someone might try to explain to you, originally pawns could only move one square, and so they could always be captured by this pawn. But then when they changed the rules to allow pawns to move 2 squares, they also changed the rules to allow this capture. That may be true. It might be legend or folklore. I don't know. Regardless, it is a rule. On the very next turn, after a pawn jumped forward 2 squares, past the possible capture square, you can capture it with en passant. If you wait and do something else first, now you cannot capture here, because this pawn could have legitimately moved past you by that point. Okay. You'll notice this pawn can go forward, but it cannot go backward. No pawn can go backward, and in no situation can a pawn move sideways. It just doesn't happen. Pawns only move forward, and they only capture diagonally, like so. Okay? Now, let's see. It's black's turn. There is a special rule. If a pawn ever gets to the end, and I'm trying to think of how to show this really quickly. I have to get some pieces out of the way. But if any player ever gets their pawn all the way to the other side, it can promote and become one of the other pieces. One of these. A queen, a bishop, a knight, or a rook. Almost always it will promote to a queen because it's the most powerful, which we will get to in a minute. Now, that's all the pawn rules. They cannot go through another piece. If there's a piece in front of it, it can't go there. Like all the other pieces, they cannot go on the square where their own piece is. So, for example, this pawn then cannot go here. It can only go forward. If an enemy piece were here, it could capture it, but it cannot capture its own piece. All right, next piece we're going to cover is the knight. The knight is unique in that it is the only piece in chess that can jump over other pieces. And it's also the only piece that moves in this weird shape, which looks a little bit like an L, and it can go in any direction. For example, here. Now you'll see, now this knight has several squares that it can go to. It could also go here if there were not something in the way. Or it can go back to where it was. Knight in the center of the board, one of these 4 squares, is very powerful because of how many squares it can go to. 8. Well, right now it can't go to these 2 because there's something in the way. But if those pawns were not there, or if those were enemy pieces, then the knight could also go there. But that's as far as they can go on one turn. So, there you go. Like most of the pieces, not pawns, but all the other pieces, knights capture in the exact direction that they move. So, next is the bishops. That's these 2. They only move diagonally. And they cannot jump over other pieces. So right now these 2 bishops can't move at all. That's why this is one of the very first moves in many chess games, because it opens the possibility for this bishop. So now this bishop has a choice. See all those green dots? Those are the squares where this bishop can legally move. This is a dark squared bishop, and because it only moves diagonally, it will never be on the light squares. This is a light squared bishop. It will only ever be on the light squares. These 2 bishops will never be able to occupy the same squares, so they will never be able to capture one another. However, if in the course of the game the other bishop gets out, the 2 light squared bishops see each other. And the 2 dark squared bishops could possibly see each other and therefore capture one another. Okay? Next is the rooks. The rooks are very often the last of the pieces to get out because of where they are. They're behind pawns, they're behind their knights. They don't have a lot of places to go. But once they do get out, and let's just do something silly and move these so these rooks can't get out. Rooks go forward, sideways, like so. as many squares as they want. They can also go backward if they want. Okay? Now, there is a special, I'm going backwards here, undoing these moves. Rooks can work with the king to do something called castling, but we will get to that move when we get to the kings. All right? Now, the queens are left. They are the most powerful pieces because they can move diagonally and horizontally, as many open squares as they have. Now, in a game where there's a lot more space, queens suddenly become much more powerful. As you see here, the queen is very limited. It has a choice of those squares. And you don't want to go here because if you'll remember, pawns capture diagonally. It could go here and capture that piece, but then it could be captured. Okay, regardless, queens are very powerful. Now that it's out here, look how many squares it can go to. All those green dots. Because it can move horizontally, diagonally, in any direction. Can't go here because of its own piece. Now, if all these pieces are cleared out and you put a queen in the middle of the board, it can control all these diagonals, as well as side to side and front and back. That's why it's often the most valuable piece. It's worth the most points if you keep track of points, but points aren't how you win and lose chess games, but people came up with points so they could keep track of the value of the pieces that they still have on the board. Queen is usually worth 9, with the rook is 5, and then the bishops and the knights worth 3 apiece. Pawns are typically counted as 1 point. Now this value becomes relative. Like this rook isn't worth anything right now because it's trapped, can't go anywhere. Same with this rook. But that's how the queen moves, as you see. Diagonally, horizontally, vertically, as many pieces as there's space. If it's an enemy piece in the way, they can capture. If it's its own piece in the way, then it can't go that direction. Okay, now the king. Let's see, white's turn. Kings can move in the same direction as queens, but only 1 square at a time. This king only has 1 choice right now. You think, wait, why can't it go here or here? That's a special rule that only applies to kings. Any other piece can move into a position where it could be captured. For example, I can move my queen to this spot where the opponent can capture me. And they can move their queen into this spot where I can capture them. The king cannot. It's called moving into check. This bishop, as you can see, can go anywhere and capture anything on this diagonal, including that square and that square. So, if the bishop were not here, now you see the king has 3 legal moves. But the bishop is here, so the king only has 1 legal move. But let's capture that bishop. So now the king, wait, it's their turn. Look at that. The king has all those squares. And if this pawn were not here, this king has all those squares it can go to. As long as none of my pieces are guarding or attacking any of those squares, the king can go there. Not that it would really want to move forward, but it can. Now, you've noticed, wait, I thought the king could only move 1 square at a time. Why is there a circle there? That is because of a special rule called castling. If the king has not been moved yet, and if this rook has not been moved yet, and if there are no pieces between them, as you can see, there are not, you can do what's called castling. Isn't that cool? Gets the rook out of the corner and gets the king into the corner, which most of the time is a good place to be. Let's say we move this instead, and they move this instead. Now, look at that. There's another dot over here. Because the king can castle in either direction. Either way, as long as the rooks haven't moved yet, and as long as the king hasn't moved yet, it can castle. So no squares no pieces on any of these squares, the king moves 2 over and the rook hops across it. Or the king moves 2 over and the rook hops across it. You'll see that on this side, because the king was already closer to this corner, moving 2 squares gets it very close to the corner. On this side, moving 2 squares didn't get it quite as close to the corner. That's called castling. There is a special rule, and I'm backing up here again because I want that bishop back. There's that bishop. Even though this bishop does not attack the square where the king will end up, that's still not available. That's because the bishop is attacking the square that the king has to move through in order to castle. So not only can the king not move here, it cannot move here either, because the rule is you cannot castle through check. Incidentally, you can also not castle while in check. That is, if there were a piece directly currently attacking the king, then you cannot castle. Okay, let's actually get the king in check, and we're going to back up. Okay, now, a typical game might start like this. Let's see. Let's say this was white's next move. Now, if the queen moves here, that's attacking our king. So let's do that. That's called check. On some sites, the king glows like this, not all of them. But that's check, because your king could be captured on the next turn if you don't do something. Now, check has special rules. All the other pieces, as we've mentioned, can not only move into danger, but once they're in danger, like these 2 pawns are in danger of attacking each other, they can just stay there. You can attack them or not, capture them or not, as the case may be. But when the king is in danger of being attacked, which we call check, there are 3 possibilities, 3 choices. One is to move out of check. Cannot move here because that's also check. So I can move out of check. Or you can block. Not check, because this queen now is only attacking the pawn, and also incidentally these 2 pawns, but is no longer attacking the king. So check has been averted. One other possibility is to capture the checking piece, which in this situation we did not have the ability to do. We do not have a piece able to move to this square. But in many situations, that will be a choice. For example, if instead of moving the queen there first, black continued to develop pawns, and we put this queen here, now if they say check, now we have all 3 choices. We can move out of check, we can block check with this pawn, we can block check with this queen, or we can capture the piece that put us in check. Now we're not in check anymore. But one of those 3 things has to happen. Move out of check, block the check, or capture the checking piece. Checkmate is when you cannot do any of those 3 things. And I will just give an example. Let's say we move this, and white puts this queen here, and black does this. Now, that's checkmate. The reason is you cannot move out of check because the queen also guards those 2 squares. You cannot block because there's no square between them and no piece that could get to the non-existent square between them. And you cannot capture the checking piece because none of these pieces capture that way, right? The king cannot capture this because that would be moving into check, which is against the rules. So this would be checkmate. Yes, you might have noticed this was checkmate on move 4. It's happened in a real game. I have actually won games and 4 moves before, but you won't do that very often. And all it requires is that the other player not see that these 2 pieces are pointing at this pawn, so doing nothing to guard it. For example, if they did see it, they could put this knight here, and now it guards that pawn. But if they did something else, like that, that's checkmate. Okay, now that's 20 minutes, but you have learned how all the pieces move. Pawns, 1 or 2 on the first move. Any pawn can move on the first turn, and any knight can move on the first turn, because knights can jump over pawns, or any other piece for that matter. So there are, if you'll notice, 8 pawns, so that means 16 possibilities for pawns, and a total of 4 possibilities for knights. So 20 possible first moves. Yet you will almost always see either this or this as the first move. And we have covered how bishops go diagonally. The light squared bishop will always only be on light squares. The dark squared bishop will always only ever be on dark squares. We covered how the rooks move from forward and back and side to side. Let's see, there's a rook. Now it can go here. And so on. We covered how pawns capture diagonally. We covered how knights move. We covered how queens move. Let's get them out there so they have a chance. Horizontally, diagonally, vertically, for an awful lot of possibilities for the queens. And kings, we covered. Same direction as the queen. Well, not there, obviously, but only one square at a time, except for castling, which we also covered. So those are the basic moves of chess, and those are all the rules. I believe I included everything. There is one rule I did not mention, and that is stalemate. There are a couple of ways to stalemate, which is one way of saying draw, where nobody wins, nobody loses. Let me just mention that. You can draw by agreement, which means I don't know what to do, and the opponent doesn't know what to do, or neither one of you think you can win, yet you don't think the other person can win. You will offer a draw. If the opponent accepts, that's it. Neither one of you wins, neither one of you loses. Like, say a soccer game ends in 0-0, it's a draw. Okay, that's one way. Another way is called threefold repetition. That is when 2 pieces make the same moves over and over, back and forth. It's actually not the same repeated moves, it's repeated positions, but usually it's the same thing. So if these 2 pieces just keep moving back and forth, after 3 times, that's a stalemate, or a draw, by threefold repetition. Now, one other way is when a player has no legal moves. This often happens very late in the game, when there aren't that many pieces left. But it happens where you do not have your opponent in check, but they can't move. Like, say, usually they only have a king left, and you've blocked off all the squares around them with danger squares, squares that would be check if the king moves there. The king's not allowed to move into check, and if he's not in check right now, it's not checkmate. So that's a stalemate, when the king has, one player has no legal moves. That is also a draw. Nobody wins, nobody loses. So again, I hope to make a follow-up video on some basic strategies. But this is the video on how to play chess. If something wasn't clear, feel free to hit me up in the comments. Thank you for watching.